Hello everyone, I am the Boring Historian, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. In the dimly lit alleyways of medieval towns and the shadowy forests along country roads, a desperate class of individuals risked everything for survival. The medieval thief lived a precarious existence, perpetually balanced between starvation and the hangman's noose. Unlike the romanticized portrayal in modern fiction, the reality of being a thief in medieval Europe was brutal, short-lived, and fraught with dangers from every direction. This narrative explores the harsh realities faced by those who turned to theft in an era when property crimes were often punished more severely than violent offenses. From the moment they chose, or were forced into, a life of thievery, these individuals embarked on a perilous journey that usually ended in public humiliation, physical mutilation, or death. The medieval thief's story is not merely one of criminality, but a window into the complex social, economic, and legal structures that shaped medieval society. It reveals how justice was administered, how property was valued, and how the powerful maintained control over the desperate and dispossessed. Above all, it illustrates why, of all the difficult lives one might lead in the Middle Ages, that of a thief was among the most precarious and condemned. Medieval Europe, spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, was a society built on rigid hierarchies, religious authority, and the protection of property rights. Following the collapse of the Roman Empire, various systems of law and order emerged across Europe, from the common law tradition in England to the provincial codes in Scandinavia and the Roman law influences in southern Europe. At the heart of medieval justice was the concept of lex talionis, or the law of retaliation, which dictated that punishment should match the crime in severity. This principle, often summarized as an eye for an eye, formed the foundation of many judicial systems across medieval Europe. However, in practice, punishments frequently exceeded the severity of the crimes themselves, particularly for property offenses. Crime in medieval society was viewed not just as an offense against the victim, but as a disruption of the divine and natural order. The Church played a significant role in the administration of justice, with bishops and other ecclesiastical officials often serving as judges. Religious concepts of sin and redemption were deeply intertwined with the secular punishment of crimes. The medieval period saw the gradual development and formalization of legal codes. In the 13th century, for example, provincial codes of law were committed to writing in Sweden, detailing punishments for various offenses, including theft. King Magnus Eriksson of Sweden established a national legal code in 1279, specifically designed to protect farmers' property, with harsh penalties for theft that remained in use until 1734. Throughout this period, the administration of justice was often localized and inconsistent. Noble landowners frequently held the right to try and punish criminals on their lands, creating a patchwork of enforcement that varied widely across regions. In England, while the formal process of trying and sentencing criminals was reserved for royally approved judges, noble landowners had the right to hang any thief caught red-handed on their property. The medieval understanding of crime was also shaped by concepts of moral failing and personal responsibility. The 14th century Swedish law codex Västmanalagen stated in its preamble that the law is established and instituted to the guidance of all people, both rich and poor, in the distinction between right and wrong. This reflects the prevailing view that criminal behavior represented a moral failure requiring correction through punishment. For the medieval thief, This historical context created a dangerous environment where their crimes were viewed not just as violations of property rights, but as moral transgressions against God and society. The punishments they faced were designed not only to penalize, but to make an example of them to deter others and reinforce the social order. Medieval society was structured around a rigid social hierarchy that profoundly influenced how justice was administered. At the top stood the nobility and clergy, followed by merchants and craftspeople, with peasants and serfs at the bottom. This stratification was reflected in every aspect of the legal system, creating a deeply unequal application of justice that made life particularly dangerous for lower-class thieves. The punishment for theft varied significantly depending on the social status of both the perpetrator and the victim. A nobleman who stole might face a fine or temporary loss of privileges, while a peasant committing the identical crime could be executed. This disparity was not considered unjust by medieval standards, but was seen as a natural reflection of the divinely ordained social order. In Hungary, for example, King Saint Stephen I's law, early 11th century, explicitly differentiated punishments based on social status. If a servant stole, they faced nose-cutting for a first offense and ear-cutting for a second, with execution reserved for a third transgression. A free person who stole could compensate for their first offense or be sold into servitude, facing corporal punishment only for subsequent crimes. For the medieval thief of low birth, this social inequality created a deadly paradox. Economic hardship might push them toward theft as a survival strategy, but the legal system punished them more harshly precisely because of their low status. Meanwhile, the wealthy and powerful, who rarely needed to steal for survival, faced much less severe consequences if they did appropriate others' property. The relationship between lord and peasant also complicated matters of theft. When a peasant stole from their lord, it was considered not just theft, but a betrayal of the feudal relationship, potentially warranting even harsher punishment. Conversely, when lords exploited or seized property from their subordinates through excessive taxation or arbitrary seizure, such actions were rarely classified as theft at all, despite their similar economic impact. This social inequity extended to the process of justice itself. Wealthy defendants could often pay compensation to avoid physical punishment, while the poor had no such option. In many regions, the testimony of higher status individuals was weighted more heavily than that of the lower classes, making it nearly impossible for a peasant accused of stealing from a noble to mount an effective defense, regardless of actual guilt or innocence. The medieval justice system's social bias created a situation where the poorest members of society, those most likely to resort to theft out of desperation, faced the most severe punishments. This reality added another layer of misery to the already difficult existence of the medieval thief, who not only risked harsh physical punishment, but did so within a system deliberately stacked against them from the start. The economic landscape of medieval Europe created the desperate conditions that drove many individuals to theft. For the vast majority of the population, survival was a constant struggle against hunger, disease, and destitution. Understanding this economic context is crucial to comprehending why people risked such severe punishments by turning to thievery. Medieval society operated primarily on an agricultural economy, where most people worked the land as peasants or serfs. Their livelihood depended entirely on successful harvests, which were frequently threatened by adverse weather, plant diseases, and pest infestations. A single failed harvest could push entire communities to the brink of starvation, creating conditions where theft became a desperate survival strategy rather than a moral choice. The feudal economic system required peasants to surrender significant portions of their produce to their lords, leaving them with barely enough to survive even in good years. These obligations, combined with church tithes and various taxes, meant that most commoners lived perpetually on the edge of subsistence. When additional pressures like warfare, plague, or increased taxation were added to this precarious balance, many found themselves with no legal means to feed their families. Urban environments offered different economic challenges. Cities attracted the destitute from rural areas, creating concentrated pockets of poverty, while towns provided opportunities for legitimate work in crafts and trade. These positions were often controlled by guilds with strict membership requirements and apprenticeship systems that excluded many newcomers. Those unable to secure guild-protected work found themselves among the urban poor, performing casual labor when available, or turning to begging, prostitution, or theft. Economic inequality was stark and visible in medieval society. The ostentatious wealth displayed by nobility and wealthy merchants, in their clothing, jewelry, and household goods, stood in sharp contrast to the grinding poverty of the majority. This visible disparity, combined with limited social mobility, created both opportunity and motivation for theft. Valuable items were abundant and obvious targets, while the perceived injustice of such extreme inequality might have helped some thieves rationalize their actions. Certain periods saw dramatic increases in economic hardship and corresponding rises in theft. The Great Famine of 1315-1317 devastated Northern Europe, killing an estimated 10 to 25% of the population. In its wake, desperate survivors turned to theft at unprecedented rates. Similarly, the economic disruptions following the Black Death, 1347 to 1351, created labor shortages and social upheaval that altered traditional economic relationships and property norms. For women, economic desperation was often even more acute. With limited independent economic opportunities and lower wages when employment was available, women who lacked male support through widowhood or abandonment faced particularly stark choices. Many turned to theft as one of the few available means of survival, despite the severe risks involved. The economic pressures that drove medieval theft were not merely individual hardships, but systemic features of feudal society. The vast majority of thieves were not professional criminals by choice, but ordinary people, pushed to desperate measures by a rigid economic system that offered them few legitimate paths to survival during times of hardship. Medieval legal systems approached theft with a complexity that belies modern assumptions about the period's supposed primitive justice. Different regions developed distinct legal traditions, but certain principles regarding theft remained relatively consistent across medieval Europe, creating a legal landscape that was uniformly dangerous for those who stole. The concept of ownership was fundamental to medieval law, defined as having permanent or legal right to exclusively control and use something for one's own purposes, with few restrictions. This definition established the foundation for laws against theft, which were primarily concerned with protecting property rights, particularly those of the powerful. Many regions developed surprisingly nuanced categorizations of theft. In medieval Sweden, laws distinguished between different severities of theft based on the value of stolen goods. Full thievery meant stealing something worth half a mark or more, and was punished by hanging or banishment. Lesser thefts received correspondingly less severe punishments, from flogging and ear removal to simple fines. The legal process itself varied significantly across regions. In England, the common law tradition established precedent-based legal principles, while continental Europe often relied more heavily on codified Roman law influences. In Scandinavia, early legal traditions were initially maintained through oral tradition before being codified in the 13th century. Proof of theft presented particular challenges in medieval legal proceedings. Physical evidence was crucial, with broken locks serving as important proof of illegal entry. In many jurisdictions, being caught red-handed, a term originating from having blood-stained hands from stealing livestock, resulted in summary justice with minimal legal process. Those not caught in the act but later accused faced varying standards of evidence, often including trial by ordeal in earlier periods, or testimony from witnesses of good standing. Responsibility for theft extended beyond the individual perpetrator in many legal codes. In medieval Hungary, if a married woman stole something, her husband was required to compensate for it until the third offense, at which point the woman herself could be sold. Similarly, household heads could be held accountable for thefts committed by their servants or family members, creating complex webs of legal liability. The Church's influence on theft laws was substantial. The seventh commandment, "Thou shalt not steal," provided religious backing for secular prohibitions against theft. Church courts could impose their own penalties, including excommunication, which carried severe social and spiritual implications. The religious dimension added moral weight to theft prohibitions, casting thieves not just as criminals but as sinners violating divine law. Legal frameworks evolved throughout the medieval period. The 16th century saw significant changes in many regions, with punishments like prison terms with bread and water and the commutation of death penalties to fines or labor becoming more common. However, certain thefts, particularly stealing from churches, remained capital offenses throughout the period. For the medieval thief, these legal frameworks created a hazardous environment where punishment was severe and often public. Legal processes were stacked against the accused of lower social status, and the religious dimensions of their crime added spiritual peril to the physical dangers they already faced. The complexity and severity of medieval theft laws made the thief's existence particularly precarious, regardless of which European legal tradition held sway in their region. Medieval thievery encompassed a diverse range of criminal activities, each with its own techniques, risks, and cultural associations. The various types of thieves faced different challenges and punishments, though all operated under the shadow of potential execution or mutilation if caught. The urban centers of medieval Europe teemed with pickpockets and cut purses, who specialized in stealing small valuables and coins from unaware victims. Operating in crowded marketplaces, at public executions, or during religious festivals, these thieves relied on dexterity and misdirection. Cut purses earned their name by literally cutting the strings of purses that wealthy individuals wore, hanging from their belts. These petty thieves faced particular challenges. They needed to operate in public spaces where potential victims gathered, increasing their visibility and risk of capture. Their crimes typically yielded small rewards, a few coins or minor valuables that rarely justified the severe punishments they risked. Many were children or women, pushed into the trade by extreme poverty and lack of alternatives. The dangerous roads connecting medieval towns and cities provided perfect opportunities for highway robbers. These thieves targeted travelers, merchants, and messengers journeying between settlements. Operating individually or in small bands, highway robbers often used the threat of violence to compel their victims to surrender valuables. Highway robbery was particularly dangerous as both crime and profession. Roads were poorly policed, giving robbers operational freedom, but the crime itself was considered especially serious. Robbers disrupted commerce and communication between communities, threatened the king's peace on public roads, and often employed violence. Consequently, captured highway robbers typically faced execution with little hope of mercy. Breaking into homes, shops, and storehouses required different skills and presented unique risks. Medieval burglars operated under cover of darkness, using rudimentary tools to defeat locks and access secured spaces. The legal consequences were severe. A broken lock served as proof of illegal entry and intent to steal, making defense against burglary charges particularly difficult. Medieval laws in many regions specifically addressed locked versus unlocked spaces. In Sweden, farmers were responsible for locked buildings on their property, but not those without locks. If stolen goods were found in a locked space, the owner of that space was considered complicit in the crime. This created a complex landscape of risk and responsibility that burglars had to navigate. Perhaps no type of theft more clearly illustrated the class divisions of medieval society than poaching. Game animals in forests were often claimed as the exclusive property of nobility, making hunting by commoners a form of theft punishable by severe penalties, including death, blinding, or mutilation. Poachers operated in forested areas, using snares, traps, and bows to take deer, boar, and other animals claimed by the lord. Their crime was particularly fraught with class tension. Peasants starving while animals they could eat roamed nearby, protected by laws they had no voice in creating. Forest laws were among the most resented legal restrictions of the medieval period, and poachers sometimes enjoyed a degree of community support not afforded to other thieves. Not all medieval theft involved direct taking of property. Confidence tricksters, fraudulent merchants, and those selling false relics or miracle cures operated throughout the period. These criminals relied on deception rather than stealth or force, exploiting religious faith, desperation, or simple greed. Fraud occupied an ambiguous position in medieval law. While clearly a form of theft in stealing value through deception, it often proved harder to prosecute than direct property crimes. Victims might be reluctant to admit being duped, and proving fraudulent intent could be challenging. Nevertheless, when caught and convicted, fraudsters faced punishments similar to other thieves, with execution, mutilation, or banishment as common outcomes. Each type of medieval thief faced specific risks and developed specialized techniques to mitigate them. What unified them was their precarious position. Always one witness, one mistake, or one betrayal away from a brutal punishment that would serve as a public warning to others contemplating a similar path. For the medieval thief, each day represented a delicate balance between the desperate need to steal for survival and the ever-present risk of capture and punishment. Their daily existence was characterized by hunger, fear, vigilance, and the constant search for opportunity. A grinding routine far removed from romantic notions of the clever rogue or noble outlaw. Dawn typically found the thief already alert and observant. Those who had secure shelter, an uncommon luxury for most, would emerge cautiously, aware that their movements might be watched by suspicious neighbors or authorities. Many thieves, particularly in urban areas, had no fixed abode, instead sleeping in alleyways, abandoned buildings, or outside city walls, making them vulnerable to elements and violence. Morning hours presented both opportunities and dangers. Markets filled with potential victims carrying coins and goods, but also with watchful merchants and city guards. A successful thief needed to blend seamlessly with the crowds, appearing as just another laborer, servant, or peasant going about legitimate business. This required maintaining an appropriate appearance, challenging for those living in poverty with limited access to clean clothing or bathing facilities. Hunger was a constant companion and primary motivator. Most thieves stole not luxury goods but basic necessities: food, clothing, or items easily converted to cash for these essentials. The urban thief might spend hours observing a baker's shop, waiting for the brief moment when attention lapsed and a loaf could be snatched. Rural thieves might risk entering fields at dawn to take crops or sneak into barns for eggs or milk. Afternoon activities often involved planning and reconnaissance. Identifying potential targets required careful observation. Which households had valuable goods, when shops would be unattended, which travelers carried purses that suggested wealth. This information gathering needed to appear innocent, as anyone noticed lingering too long or asking too many questions would draw immediate suspicion. For those who had stolen successfully, the challenge shifted to disposing of the goods. Few thieves could risk keeping stolen items, as possession of unexplained valuables was itself evidence of theft. This necessitated relationships with receivers of stolen goods, tavern keepers, disreputable merchants, or corrupt craftspeople willing to melt down stolen metal or rework identifiable items into anonymous ones. These transactions typically returned only a fraction of an item's true value to the thief. Evening brought new dangers and opportunities. Darkness provided cover for burglary and highway robbery, but also increased the suspicion attached to anyone moving about without obvious, legitimate purpose. City gates closed at nightfall in many medieval towns, meaning those caught outside faced a night exposed to elements and dangers, or risky attempts to scale walls to return. Social interactions were fraught with peril. Other thieves could be competitors or collaborators, but were always potential betrayers if caught, and offered leniency in exchange for naming accomplices. Legitimate society offered little sanctuary. Known or suspected thieves were shunned, denied honest work, and often physically driven from communities. Even family relationships became complicated, as relatives might reject a thief to protect their own standing or be implicated in their crimes through association. Sleep, when it came, was often light and interrupted. Whether in squalid urban hiding places or rural hedgerows, thieves needed to remain alert to approaching danger. Many developed the habit of sleeping in short bursts rather than through the night, a practice born of necessity but contributing to the exhaustion and stress that characterized their lives. This daily cycle of risk, vigilance, and desperation took a severe physical and psychological toll. Few career thieves survived long, either falling to execution, imprisonment, injury, or the myriad diseases that flourished in the unsanitary conditions where they were forced to live. Those who managed to evade capture often found that the constant stress and poor living conditions claimed them almost as surely, if more slowly, than the hangman's noose. The decision to become a thief in medieval Europe rarely stemmed from a simple desire for ill-gotten wealth. Instead, a complex web of motivations drove individuals to risk severe punishment by taking others' property. Understanding these motivations provides crucial insight into why people would choose such a dangerous and socially condemned path. Survival necessity was undoubtedly the most common motivation. In a society where famine was recurrent and social safety nets minimal, theft often represented a last desperate attempt to secure food for oneself or one's family. During periods of widespread crop failure, such as the Great Famine of 1315–1317, instances of theft increased dramatically as people faced the stark choice between stealing and starvation. For many, particularly those without family support or guild membership, theft became not a moral failing, but a survival mechanism. Economic displacement pushed many into thievery. Wars, changing agricultural practices, and urban migration created populations of former peasants, discharged soldiers, and unemployed laborers with few legitimate economic opportunities. those who had lost their traditional place in the economic order, widows without male relatives, orphaned children, the elderly without family support, were particularly vulnerable to becoming thieves when legitimate options for sustenance disappeared. For some, theft represented resistance against perceived injustice. The extreme inequality of medieval society, where nobles lived in luxury while peasants starved, created resentment that sometimes manifested as theft. Poaching in particular often carried elements of class resistance, with peasants defying forest laws that prohibited them from hunting animals in the Lord's woods, even during times of famine. These social bandits sometimes enjoyed community support and protection, though this rarely saved them if caught by authorities. Opportunity and proximity to wealth motivated others. Servants in noble households, for instance, had daily access to valuable goods combined with intimate knowledge of household routines. While their position gave them opportunity, their low wages relative to the luxury surrounding them provided justification. Similarly, apprentices or journeymen might steal from masters who treated them poorly, seeing theft as compensation for exploitation. Addiction and vice drove some into criminal behavior. Gambling was widespread in medieval society despite frequent prohibitions, and those who accumulated gambling debts often turned to theft to cover their losses. Alcohol dependency likewise created financial pressures that legitimate income couldn't satisfy, particularly for day laborers whose work was seasonal and inconsistent. For a small minority, theft became a deliberate career choice. Professional thieves developed specialized skills, picking locks, identifying valuable items, creating disguises, and operated within criminal networks that facilitated the disposal of stolen goods. These career criminals represented a small percentage of medieval thieves, but typically operated longer and more successfully than opportunistic thieves, driven purely by immediate need. Children were often drawn or forced into theft through lack of alternatives. Orphaned or abandoned children in medieval cities formed groups that survived through petty theft, begging, and performing minor services. These child thieves were simultaneously perpetrators and victims, exploited by adults who took most of their proceeds in exchange for minimal protection and training in criminal techniques. Religious minorities sometimes turned to theft when legitimate economic opportunities were denied them. Jews, for instance, faced severe restrictions on property ownership and guild membership in many regions, pushing some toward activities like money lending that, while necessary, generated resentment. When persecutions intensified, some found themselves with no option but theft for survival. The motivations behind medieval theft reveal a society where economic margins were thin, social mobility limited, and survival itself precarious for many. While medieval justice treated theft primarily as a moral failing deserving severe punishment, the reality was far more complex. A reflection of structural inequalities and limited options that forced desperate choices upon those at the bottom of the social hierarchy. Medieval thieves operated with relatively simple tools compared to modern criminals, but they developed sophisticated techniques tailored to their targets and environments. Their methods reflected both the security measures of the period and the ingenuity born of desperation. For pickpockets and cut purses working in crowded urban spaces, small, easily concealed knives were essential tools. These were used to cut the strings of purses worn hanging from belts or to slice open clothing where valuables might be hidden. Accomplices were also crucial tools in this trade, one thief creating a distraction while another executed the theft. Common techniques included feigning illness, starting arguments, or simply bumping into the victim while apologizing profusely as an accomplice removed valuables during the confusion. burglars required more substantial tools to defeat the locks and barriers protecting valuable property. Simple metal pries, similar to modern crowbars, were used to force doors or windows. Picks made from animal bones or metal were employed to manipulate lock mechanisms. Fire provided both light for nighttime operations and a means of creating emergency exits through wooden structures. Cloth wrapped around feet muffled sounds, while dark clothing provided camouflage in unlit medieval buildings. The effectiveness of locks as deterrents varied widely in medieval Europe. While sophisticated locks existed, they were expensive and relatively rare. Many households relied on simple wooden bars or primitive locks that skilled thieves could defeat relatively easily. This created a security arms race where a lock can in fact inhibit and increase the risk of theft at the same time. People were aware that locked doors or chests often hid things of value. Highway robbers employed techniques designed to maximize advantage and minimize risk. Common strategies included disguising themselves as travelers to approach victims without raising alarm, using terrain features like narrow passes to trap targets, or creating obstacles in the road to force travelers to stop. While violence was always implicit in highway robbery, most robbers preferred threats to actual violence. Dead victims couldn't spread word of the robber's reputation, which often proved as effective as actual violence in ensuring compliance. Poachers developed particularly sophisticated techniques out of necessity. They operated in forests patrolled by foresters specifically employed to prevent their activities, and where discovery meant severe punishment. Silent weapons like snares and traps allowed them to avoid detection, while knowledge of animal behavior helped them identify productive hunting locations. Methods for quickly butchering and concealing game developed, as possession of prohibited animal parts constituted evidence of poaching. Some poachers even developed techniques for hunting at night when foresters were less active. Fraudsters relied on psychological techniques rather than physical tools. They exploited knowledge of human behavior, greed, faith, compassion, or fear to manipulate victims. Common schemes included selling fake relics to the devout, offering miraculous cures to the desperate, or claiming to be dispossessed nobles needing temporary loans. These confidence tricksters developed elaborate personas and narratives designed to overcome skepticism and create trust. Disposal of stolen goods represented a critical technical challenge for all thieves. Distinctive items needed to be altered to prevent identification, jewelry melted down, clothing restyled, identifying marks removed from livestock. Networks of receivers developed who specialized in purchasing stolen goods at substantial discounts and either modifying them or moving them to distant markets where their origins wouldn't be recognized. Communication techniques were essential for thieves operating in groups. Many developed specialized vocabulary, an early form of criminal cant or slang, that allowed them to communicate without being understood by potential victims or authorities. Visual signals and meeting places known only to criminal associates provided additional security. Disguise represented another important technique. Thieves might dress as pilgrims, merchants, or clergy to gain trust and access. The limited documentation of the period made such impersonations relatively easy, though punishments for impersonating certain roles, particularly clergy, could be severe if discovered. These tools and techniques reveal medieval thieves not as impulsive criminals, but as practitioners of crafts requiring skill, planning, and knowledge. The sophistication of these methods, developed despite limited resources and technology, testifies to the ingenuity born of desperation and the high stakes involved in medieval theft. Female thieves in medieval Europe navigated a criminal landscape complicated by gendered expectations, limitations, and assumptions. Their experiences differed substantially from their male counterparts, creating unique challenges and, occasionally, strategic advantages in their dangerous profession. Women's economic vulnerability made theft particularly tempting, yet hazardous. With fewer legitimate employment options, lower wages for comparable work, and dependence on male relatives for financial security, women who lacked family support through widowhood, abandonment, or unmarried status faced severe economic pressure. This economic precarity pushed many women toward theft as a survival strategy, particularly during periods of famine or economic disruption. The types of theft committed by women often reflected gendered access and opportunity. Women commonly stole food, clothing, or household items rather than engaging in more violent forms of theft like highway robbery. Female servants were particularly well positioned to steal from employers, having regular access to household goods. Market theft was another common female crime, with women using their legitimate presence as shoppers to conceal theft of food or small valuable items. Legal treatment of female thieves varied across regions and periods. In some areas, women received more lenient sentences based on assumptions about their reduced moral responsibility or physical capability. King Saint Stephen Fur's law in 11th century Hungary, for example, made a husband responsible for compensating his wife's theft until the third offense. In contrast, other jurisdictions imposed harsher punishments on female thieves for violating not just property laws but gendered behavioral expectations. Pregnant women occupied a particularly complicated position in medieval justice systems. Many jurisdictions developed the plea of the belly, whereby pregnant women convicted of capital crimes received temporary reprieve until after childbirth. This created a perverse incentive for female thieves to become or remain pregnant when engaged in criminal activity, though the reprieve was temporary and execution often followed after delivery. Physical punishment for female thieves sometimes differed from that imposed on men. While hanging was common for both genders, women more frequently faced drowning or burning in some regions. Corporal punishments like whipping were modified based on notions of female modesty, though rarely reduced in severity. Women were also more likely to face punishments that emphasized public shame, such as being displayed in public with stolen items. Social stigma affected female thieves differently than males. Women's moral standing was closely tied to sexual virtue in medieval society, and criminal behavior often led to assumptions of sexual impropriety as well. Female thieves frequently faced dual condemnation for their actual crime and for presumed sexual transgressions. This dual stigma made reintegration into legitimate society particularly difficult for women with criminal pasts. Women sometimes used gendered assumptions to their advantage as thieves. Pregnant women or those carrying infants could exploit expectations of female helplessness to approach potential victims without raising suspicion. Cultural taboos against physically searching women in some regions created opportunities to conceal stolen items on their persons. Women could also use gendered expectations of emotional volatility, crying, fainting, or displaying extreme distress, to create distractions enabling theft or escape. Female-specific theft techniques developed around these realities. Some women employed specially designed garments with hidden pockets for concealing stolen goods. Others operated in partnerships where a female thief would pass stolen items to a male accomplice who would quickly leave the scene, exploiting the tendency of authorities to suspect men more readily than women. The relationship between prostitution and theft created additional complexities for female thieves. Prostitutes had access to clients' belongings during intimate encounters, creating theft opportunities. However, their marginalized social position made them vulnerable to false accusations and limited their ability to defend themselves against theft charges, whether guilty or innocent. For female thieves, the intersection of gender and criminal identity created a distinctive experience of medieval theft. Their actions were constrained by gendered limitations, judged through the lens of female behavioral expectations, and punished in ways that reflected concerns about both property and proper womanhood. While all thieves in medieval Europe lived precarious lives, women navigated additional layers of risk and judgment that shaped every aspect of their criminal existence. The punishments that awaited captured thieves in medieval Europe were deliberately severe and public, designed not just to penalize the individual, but to deter others through spectacular displays of judicial violence. These punishments reflected society's view of theft as a serious threat to social order and property rights, warranting responses that modern sensibilities would consider extreme. Hanging was the most common capital punishment for theft throughout medieval Europe, particularly for repeat offenders or those who stole items of significant value. In Sweden, for instance, full thievery, stealing goods worth half a mark or more, was punished by hanging from a tree or a gallows. This punishment was not designed for quick death. Medieval hanging techniques often resulted in slow strangulation rather than the neck-breaking drop of later periods. Public execution served multiple purposes beyond simply eliminating the thief. Executions were public spectacles that drew large crowds, with the condemned often paraded through streets to the execution site. This journey provided opportunity for public repentance, reinforced the power of authorities, and created a memorable warning for potential thieves in the audience. Gallows were typically placed at city boundaries or major crossroads to maximize their visibility as deterrents. The bodies of executed thieves were frequently left hanging for extended periods, denied proper burial until they had served their full purpose as warnings. In some regions, the bodies might be covered in tar to preserve them longer as gruesome reminders of the consequences of theft. Family members sometimes risked punishment themselves by attempting to retrieve these bodies for proper Christian burial. Non-lethal but permanently disfiguring punishments were common for first or second theft offenses. Cutting off hands was a logical symbolic punishment for theft, removing the part of the body that had taken property unlawfully. This punishment not only marked the thief permanently, but also limited their ability to commit future thefts or even earn an honest living, effectively condemning them to begging or starvation. Ear removal was another common punishment, especially for intermediate value thefts. In medieval Sweden, stealing goods worth between 3 öre and half a mark would cost the thief's skin through flogging and one or both ears. The loss of an ear made the perpetrator's shame permanently visible, marking them as a thief to all who encountered them and preventing them from hiding their criminal past. Flogging represented a less permanent but still severe corporal punishment, often used for minor thefts or as part of a sequence of escalating punishments for repeat offenders. Public flogging served the dual purpose of inflicting physical pain and public humiliation. The number of lashes varied based on the severity of the theft and local custom, but could reach levels that caused permanent scarring or even death from shock and blood loss. Branding marked thieves with symbols indicating their crime, typically on visible body parts like the face, hand, or forehead. Common symbols included the letter T for thief, or specific designs indicating the nature of the crime. Like ear removal, branding created a permanent visible marker that prevented the thief from escaping their criminal identity and reintegrating into society. While long-term imprisonment was less common than corporal or capital punishment in the medieval period, short-term confinement was frequently used before trial or execution. Medieval prisons were not designed for rehabilitation or even humane containment, but rather for secure holding under miserable conditions. Prisoners were typically responsible for their own upkeep, requiring family members to provide food or payment to jailers, meaning that imprisoned thieves without resources often starved before their cases were even heard. Torture served both punitive and investigative purposes in medieval justice systems. Suspected thieves might be tortured to extract confessions or information about accomplices or the location of stolen goods. Methods included strappato, suspension by the arms tied behind the back, water torture, and various devices designed to cause extreme pain without immediate death. The threat of torture often induced confessions regardless of actual guilt, contributing to the precarious legal position of accused thieves. Shame punishments emphasized the thief's transgression against community norms. These included being placed in stocks or pillories in public squares, where the restrained thief would be exposed to public ridicule, verbal abuse, and sometimes humiliation, and sometimes physical mistreatment. The pillory, which restrained the head and hands through holes in wooden boards, was particularly associated with punishing thieves, exposing them to public abuse while limiting their ability to protect themselves. Shame processions forced thieves to parade through town wearing or carrying symbols of their crime, sometimes accompanied by musicians drawing attention to their disgrace. These processions maximized community exposure to the thief's punishment, ensuring their reputation was thoroughly destroyed even if they survived the physical punishment that typically followed. The psychological impact of these public humiliation punishments should not be underestimated. In close-knit medieval communities, where reputation and social standing were crucial for economic survival, public shaming could be as devastating as physical punishment, effectively cutting the thief off from the social networks necessary for survival. The collective impact of these punishment methods created an environment where being caught stealing even once could lead to permanent physical disability, social ostracism, or death. The deliberate publicity and cruelty of these punishments reflected society's view of theft as not just a crime against individual property owners, but a transgression against the social and divine order that required spectacular retribution. Behind the general patterns of medieval theft and punishment lie individual stories that illuminate how theft operated in practice and the diverse fates that awaited those who chose or were forced into this dangerous way of life. While most thieves remained anonymous in historical records, appearing only in court documents or execution accounts, some left more substantial traces that allow us to reconstruct their experiences. In 1285, in the English village of Wickhambrook, Adam the leper was accused of stealing grain worth 1 penny from William of Ashfield's barn. Adam's case highlights the desperate circumstances that drove many to theft. As a leper, he was socially ostracized and had extremely limited legitimate economic options. The court records show that Adam was sentenced to hanging despite the minimal value of his theft, demonstrating the harsh justice applied even to the most vulnerable when they violated property rights. Adam's case also reveals how medieval justice sometimes made examples of marginalized individuals. As both a thief and a leper, Adam represented dual forms of social transgression, making him an ideal subject for exemplary punishment. The court explicitly noted that his execution would serve as a warning to others, prioritizing deterrence over any consideration of the desperate circumstances that drove his crime. Records from 14th century Marseille document the case of Gisela, a pregnant woman caught stealing food from a market stall. Invoking the plea of the belly, Gisela received a temporary reprieve from execution until after she delivered her child. Her case illustrates how female thieves navigated a gendered legal landscape, sometimes exploiting protections afforded to them as potential mothers. The aftermath of Gisela's case reveals the limited nature of such protection, however. Court documents show that she was executed 3 weeks after giving birth, with her infant sent to a church orphanage. The temporary nature of her reprieve underscores that while gender could modify the timing or methods of punishment, it rarely led to substantial mercy for thieves in medieval justice systems. The Fallville brothers of Leicestershire, England, represent a different class of medieval thieves, gentry who used their social position to engage in organized criminal activity. Between 1326 and 1347, this family conducted highway robberies, extorted money through threats, and even arranged the murder of a royal justice. Their case demonstrates how theft occasionally operated as an organized enterprise rather than merely individual survival strategy. Unlike most thieves, the Fallvilles enjoyed partial protection due to their social status and political connections. Several brothers received royal pardons by agreeing to serve in the king's military campaigns. Eustace Fallville, the leader, eventually died of natural causes rather than execution, an extraordinarily rare outcome for someone with his criminal history. Their story highlights how social class profoundly influenced both the practice of theft and its consequences in medieval society. Court records from 15th century Paris detail the career of Nicolas Genin, a professional pickpocket who operated for years before his eventual capture. Genin's confession, extracted under torture, reveals sophisticated techniques, including working with accomplices who created diversions while he cut purses from belts. He targeted crowded church services and public executions, where potential victims were distracted by the spectacle. Genin's punishment exemplifies the escalating nature of medieval penalties for repeat offenders. Having been previously caught and branded for theft, his second conviction resulted in hanging at Montfaucon gallows. The court specifically referenced his failure to reform after his first punishment as justification for capital punishment, illustrating the medieval approach to recidivism. In 1394, John Rykener was arrested in London while engaging in prostitution while dressed as a woman using the name Eleanor. During questioning, Rykener confessed to numerous thefts from clients, using his ambiguous gender presentation to gain access to potential victims and their property. His case reveals the intersection between sexual and property crimes in medieval urban environments, and how some thieves exploited cultural assumptions and taboos. Surprisingly, records show that Rykener was eventually released rather than executed, possibly because authorities were more concerned with his sexual transgressions than his thefts. This unusual outcome demonstrates how sometimes the complex interplay of multiple social transgressions could create unpredictable results within the medieval justice system. In 1347, William Pickering was convicted of stealing a silver chalice from York Minster in England. Theft from churches was considered particularly heinous, combining property crime with sacrilege. Pickering's punishment was correspondingly severe. He was dragged through the streets to the gallows, then hanged, with his body left displayed until it decomposed. Pickering's case demonstrates the religious dimensions of medieval theft and how violating sacred spaces aggravated an already serious crime. The spectacular nature of his punishment reflected not just the value of what was stolen, but the spiritual transgression involved, showing how religious concepts thoroughly permeated medieval approaches to justice. These individual cases, though separated by time and geography, collectively illustrate the diverse experiences of medieval thieves. From desperate subsistence theft to organized criminal enterprises, their stories reveal both the varied motivations behind theft and the consistently harsh responses these actions provoked from medieval justice systems. Religion permeated every aspect of medieval society, profoundly shaping attitudes toward theft, the treatment of thieves, and thieves' own understanding of their actions. The Christian framework that dominated European thought created complex spiritual dimensions to what might otherwise be seen as purely economic or legal transgressions. The prohibition against theft was firmly established in religious doctrine through the seventh commandment, "Thou shalt not steal." This divine prohibition gave theft a spiritual dimension beyond its worldly consequences. By stealing, thieves violated not just human law but divine command, placing their immortal souls in jeopardy. This religious framing intensified the societal condemnation of theft and provided theological justification for harsh punishments. Church teachings emphasized that theft constituted a mortal sin, requiring confession and penance. Medieval penitentials, guidebooks for confessors, prescribed specific penances for different types of theft, typically including fasting, prayer, and material restitution. The 8th century penitential of Bede, for instance, required thieves to fast for periods ranging from 40 days to several years, depending on the severity and circumstances of the theft. For the medieval thief, religious concepts created both additional burdens and potential paths to redemption. While the law might punish their body, unconfessed theft endangered their soul, with the prospect of eternal damnation. This spiritual jeopardy added another layer of consequence beyond worldly punishment. However, Christianity also offered the possibility of forgiveness through genuine repentance, confession, and penance, a spiritual second chance even when legal mercy was unavailable. The Church's dual role as moral authority and property owner created tensions in its approach to theft. As a major landowner with extensive valuable possessions, churches and monasteries were frequent targets for thieves. Consequently, religious institutions often advocated for severe punishment of those who stole church property, arguing that such theft constituted sacrilege beyond ordinary property crime. The 13th century Swedish provincial codex, Västmanalagen for example, emphasized that stealing from churches warranted particularly harsh punishment. Public executions incorporated religious elements designed to secure the thief's salvation even while punishing their crime. Condemned thieves were encouraged to make public confessions and expressions of repentance before execution. Priests accompanied them to the gallows, hearing final confessions and offering spiritual comfort. This practice reflected the belief that while temporal punishment was necessary, the thief's eternal soul could still be saved through proper religious observance at the moment of death. Some thieves found sanctuary in churches, exploiting the medieval right of sanctuary that temporarily protected those who reached consecrated ground from secular authorities. This practice, though limited in duration and application, represented one of the few legal protections available to accused thieves. However, sanctuary typically resulted only in banishment rather than complete forgiveness, forcing the thief to leave their community and start anew elsewhere, itself a significant hardship in a society built on local reputation and relationships. Religious orders occasionally intervened in the punishment of thieves, particularly in cases involving children, the mentally impaired, or those driven by extreme poverty. Some monasteries and convents negotiated to take custody of thieves who might otherwise face execution, subjecting them instead to religious discipline and labor within the religious community. This practice remained rare and discretionary, but represented one of the few alternatives to corporal punishment or execution available in the medieval justice system. Folk religious beliefs sometimes intersected with theft in complex ways. Thieves might invoke saints associated with secrecy or protection, such as Saint Nicholas, paradoxically the patron of both thieves and merchants, or Saint Dismas, the good thief, crucified alongside Jesus. Some carried religious amulets believed to protect them from detection, or wore stolen religious items as talismans. These practices reflect how even those engaged in behavior condemned by official religion might still operate within a fundamentally religious worldview. The religious dimensions of theft created a complex moral landscape for medieval thieves. Their actions placed them in opposition to divine command and risked eternal punishment. Yet the same religious framework that condemned them also offered potential paths to forgiveness unavailable in secular justice. This duality meant that even as they violated religious prohibitions, many thieves remained deeply embedded in the religious thought world of their time, seeking divine protection for their crimes and spiritual redemption from their sins. Popular imagination often envisions medieval thieves operating within organized guilds, similar to those of legitimate craftspeople, with hierarchical structures, apprenticeship systems, and codes of conduct. While this romanticized vision rarely matched reality, various forms of criminal organization did exist in medieval Europe, creating networks that facilitated theft and the disposal of stolen goods. Unlike the elaborate thieves' guilds depicted in fiction, medieval criminal organizations typically consisted of small, loosely affiliated groups rather than formal institutions. These groups formed around family connections, neighborhood proximity, or shared experiences in prisons or workhouses. Their primary purpose was practical, providing mutual protection, sharing information about potential targets, and creating networks for disposing of stolen goods, rather than maintaining elaborate hierarchies or initiation rituals. The concept of professional criminal training did have some basis in reality. Experienced thieves often taught techniques to younger accomplices, creating informal apprenticeship relationships. In larger cities, children might be recruited into theft rings where they received instruction in pickpocketing, creating diversions, or serving as lookouts. These arrangements were exploitative rather than protective, with adult criminals taking most of the proceeds while leaving children to face punishment if caught. Fences, receivers of stolen goods, represented crucial nodes in medieval criminal networks. These individuals, often operating behind legitimate business fronts as tavern keepers, pawnbrokers, or merchants, provided thieves with cash for stolen items at a fraction of their value. A successful fence needed connections to move goods to distant markets where they wouldn't be recognized, knowledge of how to alter identifiable items, and information about what specific goods were in demand. The relationship between thieves and fences was symbiotic but unequal, with fences typically holding significant power due to thieves' urgent need to dispose of incriminating evidence. Criminal specialization emerged within larger urban areas, with different groups focusing on particular types of theft. In 14th century London, court records show distinct groups specializing in market theft, burglary, dockside pilfering, and pickpocketing. This specialization reflected both the different skills required for various types of theft and the tendency of criminals to operate in familiar territories where they understood the environment and potential targets. Territorial control became important in larger cities, with certain criminal groups claiming specific neighborhoods or market areas as their exclusive operating grounds. These territorial claims were enforced through violence against interlopers, rather than through formal agreements. Control of particular territories allowed criminal groups to develop specialized knowledge of local targets and escape routes, while establishing relationships with corrupt local officials who might offer protection in exchange for bribes or a share of proceeds. Corruption formed a critical element of medieval criminal organization, creating protection for thieves through relationships with officials. Court records from various European cities document cases of night watchmen, minor court officials, and even judges accepting payment to ignore criminal activity, warn of impending raids, or ensure lenient treatment of captured group members. These corrupt relationships were typically personal rather than systematic, based on individual connections rather than institutional arrangements. Criminal argot, specialized vocabulary understood only by group members, developed as both a practical tool and a marker of criminal identity. This specialized language allowed thieves to communicate about potential targets, warn of danger, or plan operations without being understood by bystanders. While less developed than later criminal cant, medieval court records occasionally reference specialized terms used by thieves, suggesting early forms of this linguistic practice. The relationships between criminal groups and broader society varied considerably. In some contexts, particularly in poorer urban neighborhoods, criminal groups maintained complex relationships with non-criminal neighbors who might benefit from access to discounted stolen goods while providing hiding places or alibis when needed. These arrangements created zones of ambiguous legality where theft was simultaneously condemned in principle and tolerated in practice. While organized crime certainly existed in medieval Europe, the evidence suggests it operated on a more modest scale than popular imagination might suggest. The harsh punishments for theft and the limited technological and communication capabilities of the period constrained the development of large-scale criminal organizations. Instead, medieval thieves typically operated within small networks of trust based on personal relationships, creating sufficient organization to facilitate their criminal activities while avoiding the visibility that more formal structures would create. The experiences of thieves in medieval Europe varied significantly between urban and rural environments. Different opportunities, risks, and social contexts shaped distinct patterns of theft in towns versus countryside, creating parallel but contrasting criminal worlds. Urban theft flourished in the densely populated streets and marketplaces of medieval towns and cities. Pickpockets and cut purses operated in crowded spaces where physical proximity to potential victims was inevitable and anonymity more possible than in village settings. Markets, church services, public executions, and other gatherings that drew crowds provided ideal hunting grounds for these thieves, who could disappear into the multitude after stealing. City architecture created both opportunities and challenges for urban thieves. The narrow, winding streets of medieval towns offered numerous hiding places and escape routes, while the density of valuable goods in merchant quarters presented tempting targets. However, many cities maintained night watches, implemented curfews, and closed city gates after dark, creating a more structured security environment than existed in rural areas. Some cities require residents to participate in watch duties or hire professional guards, increasing the risks for urban thieves. Urbanization concentrated wealth and created visible inequality, providing both motivation and targets for theft. The display of luxury goods in merchant shops, the ostentatious dress of wealthy urbanites, and the proximity of extreme poverty to visible affluence created an environment where theft seemed both justified and potentially rewarding. The anonymous nature of urban interactions made it easier for thieves to operate without immediate recognition, unlike in villages where everyone knew their neighbors. Rural theft, by contrast, operated under different constraints and opportunities. Agricultural theft, stealing crops from fields, animals from pastures, or tools from farms, represented a common form of rural crime. These thefts directly targeted the means of survival in an agricultural society, making them particularly threatening to victims, while offering immediate sustenance to perpetrators during times of scarcity. The intimacy of rural communities created distinct challenges for thieves. In villages where everyone knew each other, strangers were immediately noticeable and suspicious, while locals who stole risked easy identification. This social transparency meant rural thieves often operated at night or targeted isolated properties where detection was less likely. Alternatively, some rural thieves stole from neighboring communities rather than their own. Though this strategy required travel, that itself might arouse suspicion. Seasonal patterns affected rural theft significantly. Harvest times saw increases in agricultural theft as crops reached maturity, representing both peak value and peak vulnerability. Winter brought different challenges and opportunities. Livestock confined in barns became easier targets, while the need for firewood led to timber theft from managed woodlands. These seasonal patterns reflected both the changing opportunities for theft and the fluctuating economic pressures that might drive people to steal. Poaching represented a distinctively rural form of theft with strong class dimensions. Game and forest was often claimed as the exclusive property of nobility, with commoners prohibited from hunting regardless of their need. Poachers required specialized knowledge of animal behavior, tracking skills, and familiarity with the landscape, a skill set quite different from that of urban thieves. The penalties for poaching could be particularly severe, reflecting both the value placed on game animals and the challenge to aristocratic privilege that poaching represented. Law enforcement differed dramatically between urban and rural environments. Cities typically had more formal policing structures, night watches, city guards, and specialized officials responsible for maintaining order. Rural areas relied more heavily on self-policing by communities, with village constables having limited authority and resources. This difference created contrasting risk profiles for thieves: more organized but potentially avoidable enforcement in cities versus less systematic but more intimate community surveillance in villages. The disposal of stolen goods presented different challenges in each environment. Urban thieves benefited from the presence of established fences and markets where stolen goods could be sold anonymously. Rural thieves faced more difficult challenges in converting stolen property to usable resources, often needing to travel to market towns to sell stolen goods without arousing suspicion. This logistical challenge meant rural theft more commonly targeted immediately usable items like food or tools, rather than valuable goods requiring resale. While urban and rural theft operated under different conditions, movement between these environments created connections between criminal worlds. Seasonal workers migrating between countryside and cities, peddlers traveling rural circuits, and thieves fleeing local authorities all facilitated exchanges of criminal techniques and information. Some thieves deliberately alternated between urban and rural criminal activities, adapting to changing opportunities and pressures in each environment. The contrasting experiences of urban and rural thieves highlight how theft adapted to different social and economic contexts within medieval society. While all thieves faced severe punishments if caught, the specific risks, opportunities, and techniques varied significantly, based on whether they operated in the anonymous crowds of cities or the close-knit communities of the countryside. Medieval society viewed theft not merely as a legal transgression, but as a profound moral failing that revealed fundamental flaws in the thief's character. This perception created a powerful stigma that affected thieves' lives far beyond the formal punishments imposed by authorities, often making social reintegration impossible, even for those who survived legal penalties. The language used to describe thieves in medieval texts reveals the depth of social contempt attached to the identity. Thieves were commonly described as wicked, faithless, or corrupted, terms that suggested not just criminal behavior but deep moral corruption. Legal documents frequently referred to thieves as enemies of society or workers of darkness, emphasizing their perceived opposition to community values and divine order. Unlike some other crimes that might be attributed to passion, mistake, or circumstance, theft was generally viewed as evidence of calculated moral failing. Medieval thought emphasized that theft required premeditation and deliberate choice, making it more condemnable than crimes committed in anger or passion. The deliberate nature of theft made it particularly difficult for communities to excuse or forgive, even when motivated by desperate need. Physical marking of thieves, through mutilation, branding, or distinctive clothing, ensured their status remained visible to all. These marks served multiple purposes: warning potential victims of the thief's character, preventing the thief from escaping their past through geographic relocation, and providing continuous public punishment through social exclusion. A person missing an ear or hand or bearing a branded T on their face carried their criminal identity permanently, unable to establish new social connections unaffected by their history. The religious dimensions of theft stigma were particularly powerful in a society where spiritual standing directly affected social position. Thieves were viewed as violators of divine commandment, having placed material gain above spiritual values. This religious condemnation extended beyond formal church positions to shape community attitudes, with thieves often excluded from religious ceremonies and communal prayers. The perception that thieves had chosen worldly goods over spiritual righteousness made them objects of both fear and contempt. Family members of identified thieves frequently suffered stigma by association, creating ripple effects that extended far beyond the individual criminal. In many communities, the families of executed thieves faced exclusion from economic opportunities, social gatherings, and marriage prospects. Some regions formally recognize this contamination through legal concepts like corruption of blood, which could prevent a thief's children from inheriting property or holding certain positions. This collective punishment reinforced the severity of theft stigma while creating powerful family pressure against criminal behavior. Employment opportunities essentially vanished for known thieves. Guilds explicitly prohibited membership for those with theft convictions, while individual employers refused to hire known thieves regardless of their skills. This economic exclusion created a vicious cycle. Having stolen once, often from economic necessity, the thief found legitimate economic opportunities permanently closed, increasing pressure to continue stealing for survival. The result was a form of social death that pushed many thieves into permanent criminal careers, regardless of their original intentions. Community surveillance of known thieves created a state of constant suspicion that made normal social interaction impossible. Any unexplained absence or unaccounted property could trigger accusations of new thefts, regardless of actual guilt. In many communities, known thieves were required to observe curfews, restrictions on movement, or other special limitations that marked them as objects of suspicion. This continual monitoring and presumption of guilt represented a form of ongoing punishment that extended far beyond formal legal penalties. The few medieval sources written from thieves' perspectives reveal the psychological impact of this stigma. Confession narratives from condemned thieves frequently mention social exclusion as a factor driving continued criminal behavior. Having been labeled as thieves after initial offenses, they found themselves unable to rejoin legitimate society, regardless of their efforts. The inability to escape the thief identity created despair that sometimes manifested as a sense of predetermined fate, with some thieves describing themselves as born to hang after experiencing the permanence of theft stigma. Limited mechanisms existed for formal reintegration of thieves into society. While church confession offered spiritual forgiveness, it rarely translated into social acceptance. Royal pardons occasionally provided legal clearance for specific offenses, but did little to address community perceptions. The most common path to escaping theft stigma was geographic relocation to places where one's history was unknown, a difficult proposition in a society with limited mobility and strong preference for known origins over strangers. The powerful stigma attached to theft in medieval society created a social death that often proved as consequential as the formal punishments imposed by authorities. Even thieves who escaped execution or survived mutilation found themselves permanently marked as morally corrupt and untrustworthy, excluded from the economic opportunities, social connections, and community belonging that defined medieval life. This social exclusion represents one of the most significant ways in which being a medieval thief sucked, not just risking physical punishment, but facing permanent exile from the human community that gave life meaning and made survival possible. Faced with extreme dangers both from authorities and from the harsh conditions of medieval life, thieves developed various strategies to mitigate risks, avoid capture, and survive in a world designed to eliminate them. These approaches represent the adaptive responses of people operating under severe constraints with limited options. Mobility served as a primary defense strategy for many thieves. By moving frequently between jurisdictions, thieves could avoid building the local reputation that would make them primary suspects for new crimes. This itinerant lifestyle, traveling between towns, villages, or regions, prevented authorities from developing cumulative knowledge of their activities. Court records from various European regions show that many professional thieves operated as travelers, never staying in one location long enough to attract focused attention from local authorities. Developing legitimate covers or dual identities helped some thieves blend into communities while engaging in criminal activities. A thief might work as a seasonal laborer, peddler, or pilgrim, roles that provided both legitimate income and explanations for their presence in different locations. These covers allowed thieves to observe potential targets while appearing to have legitimate business, reducing suspicion until they were ready to act. Court records mention numerous cases where thieves maintained respectable facades for extended periods before their criminal activities were discovered. Some thieves cultivated protection relationships with powerful individuals who could shield them from justice in exchange for services or a share of proceeds. These arrangements might involve corrupt officials who warned of impending arrests, local nobles who claimed jurisdiction to ensure lenient treatment, or church officials who could offer sanctuary. While these protection relationships were unreliable and often exploitative, they sometimes meant the difference between survival and execution for thieves who could establish and maintain them. Thieves frequently leveraged identity confusion in an era before standardized identification. Names were fluid, with many individuals known by multiple variants or nicknames in different contexts. By changing names when moving to new locations, thieves could effectively create new identities untainted by previous crimes. The limited communication between jurisdictions and absence of centralized criminal records made this strategy surprisingly effective, allowing some thieves to reset their identities multiple times during their criminal careers. Technical adaptations help thieves minimize the risks inherent in their activities. These included developing silent techniques for breaking into buildings, creating hidden compartments in clothing for concealing stolen items, and establishing coded communications to warn of danger. Some thieves cultivated specific skills that reduced their risk profile, learning to pick locks rather than breaking them, avoided creating noise and visible damage that might alert victims or authorities. Targeting selection represented another important survival strategy. Experienced thieves carefully chose targets that balanced potential reward against risk of capture. This might mean focusing on wealthy victims who traveled away from their home territories and thus had limited local connections to pursue justice, or selecting targets known to be reluctant to involve authorities, such as those engaged in their own questionable activities. Court records show that some thieves specifically targeted foreigners or religious minorities who had limited access to legal protection. Timing strategies reduced risk by aligning criminal activities with periods of reduced surveillance or enforcement. Many thieves operated during major festivals or celebrations when social norms relaxed and unusual behavior attracted less attention. Others synchronized their activities with predictable patterns of authority figures, striking when night watchmen were known to be at the opposite end of their routes, or when manor lords were away attending court. These temporal strategies reflected sophisticated understanding of social rhythms and institutional limitations. Cooperation networks provided mutual protection for some thieves. While formal thieves' guilds rarely existed, informal groups did form to share information about targets, warn of danger, provide alibis, or create diversions during thefts. These networks typically operated on principles of reciprocity rather than formal structure. Today's accomplice might need similar assistance tomorrow. The shared vulnerability of criminal activity created bonds of necessity, if not trust, producing collaborative relationships that increased survival chances. Risk distribution strategies spread danger across multiple participants. Some theft operations involve distinct roles: lookouts, distractors, actual thieves, and goods transporters, with different risk profiles. Those handling stolen goods might never be present at the actual theft, while those creating diversions might never touch stolen items, making it harder to prove their involvement in the crime. This division of labor reduced the risk for any individual participant while increasing the operation's overall effectiveness. Psychological adaptations helped thieves manage the constant stress of their precarious existence. Gallows humor, fatalistic beliefs, and religious syncretism that incorporated both orthodox confession and theft-specific superstitions all served as mental defense mechanisms. Some thieves developed personal rituals or carried talismans believed to provide protection from detection or capture. These psychological strategies didn't reduce actual risk, but helped thieves function under conditions of extreme stress and uncertainty. The survival strategies employed by medieval thieves reflected both the severe pressures they faced and their remarkable adaptability in responding to them. While these approaches couldn't eliminate the fundamental dangers of their profession, most career thieves still ended at the gallows eventually. They could extend survival time and improve odds in a game where the deck was stacked overwhelmingly against them. The sophistication of these strategies reveals that medieval thieves were not simply impulsive criminals, but strategic actors making calculated decisions within extremely constrained options. While thieves throughout medieval Europe faced severe punishments, significant regional variations existed in legal approaches, punishment methods, and social responses to theft. These differences reflected diverse legal traditions, cultural values, and governance structures across the continent, creating a patchwork of thief experiences that varied by location. England developed a distinctive common law approach to theft that emphasized precedent and gradually increasing procedural protections for the accused. The English system distinguished between grand larceny, theft of goods worth more than 12 pence, and petty larceny, theft of lesser value, with only the former carrying the death penalty. This value-based distinction created a more graduated punishment system than existed in many continental jurisdictions. The English jury system provided a potential, though limited, protection for accused thieves that was absent in many other regions. Local juries occasionally demonstrated reluctance to convict for capital theft offenses, particularly when the thief was driven by obvious necessity or when the punishment seemed disproportionate to the crime. Some juries deliberately undervalued stolen goods to reduce charges from capital grand larceny to non-capital petty larceny, creating a form of community moderation of harsh theft laws. Benefit of clergy represented another distinctive feature of English theft prosecution. This legal fiction allowed first-time offenders who could read or memorize a specific Bible passage, typically Psalm 51, known as the neck verse, to claim clerical status and receive more lenient punishment. While initially limited to actual clergy, this benefit gradually expanded to include educated laypeople, creating a class distinction in punishment where literate thieves, typically from higher social classes, faced less severe consequences than their illiterate counterparts. French territories operated under a more centralized system of royal justice that emphasized exemplary punishment of thieves. Public executions were elaborate spectacles designed to demonstrate royal power while deterring potential criminals. The French legal system placed greater emphasis on confession, often obtained through judicial torture, than did the English system. This procedural difference meant that accused thieves in French territories faced particularly intense pressure to confess, regardless of actual guilt. The Holy Roman Empire, covering much of Central Europe, presented a fragmented legal landscape where treatment of thieves varied dramatically between different territories, free cities, and ecclesiastical lands. Some regions, particularly commercial centers like the Hanseatic League cities, developed sophisticated written codes specifically addressing commercial theft. Other areas relied on older customary law traditions with less formal procedures. This patchwork meant that a thief crossing from one jurisdiction to another might face entirely different legal systems and punishment practices. In parts of Spain influenced by Islamic legal traditions, theft punishments sometimes reflected alternative approaches. While Christian regions of the Iberian Peninsula generally followed patterns similar to other European areas, territories with stronger Moorish influence or recent Christian reconquest sometimes retained elements of Islamic law regarding theft. These systems typically emphasized restitution and compensation alongside physical punishment, creating a somewhat different risk profile for thieves operating in these regions. Nordic legal traditions maintained distinctive features in their approach to theft well into the medieval period. The thing system, public assemblies where legal cases were decided, created more community involvement in theft judgments than existed in more hierarchical justice systems elsewhere. Early Scandinavian law placed significant emphasis on compensation to victims alongside punishment of thieves, reflecting a stronger focus on restoring harmony than on pure retribution. Swedish provincial laws, committed to writing in the 13th century, created a highly structured approach to theft punishment that explicitly linked severity to the value of stolen goods. Under the Västmannalag, a provincial law code, stealing goods worth less than 1 öre resulted in paying compensation. Theft of items worth 1 to 3 öre required compensation, plus fines. Stealing goods worth 3 öre to half a mark meant flogging and ear removal, while theft of goods worth half a mark or more resulted in hanging. This careful gradation created a more predictable punishment system than existed in many other regions. Southern European regions, particularly those with stronger Byzantine or continued Roman law influences, maintained distinctive approaches to theft. In parts of Italy, commercial theft received particular attention in legal codes due to the region's mercantile importance. Cities like Venice and Genoa developed specialized maritime theft laws addressing piracy and cargo theft, reflecting their orientation towards sea trade. The Byzantine-influenced areas of southern Italy, Sicily, and parts of the eastern Mediterranean maintained legal traditions that placed greater emphasis on mutilation than execution for theft offenses. Hand amputation was more common in these regions, reflecting Byzantine punishment traditions that sought to mark criminals permanently while preserving productive labor capacity and possibility of spiritual redemption. These regional variations meant that the experience of being a thief, and particularly of being a caught thief, could differ dramatically depending on location. A thief operating across regional boundaries might encounter entirely different procedural systems, evidence standards, and punishment practices. Some thieves exploited these jurisdictional differences strategically, preferentially operating in regions known for less severe enforcement or purposely crossing boundaries to complicate pursuit by authorities. While these regional differences created varied risk profiles for thieves, they shared a common foundation in viewing theft as a serious offense warranting severe response. Whether through hanging in England, elaborate public execution in France, or codified mutilation in Sweden, medieval European societies universally constructed theft as deserving harsh punishment. The specific forms this punishment took reflected local legal traditions, cultural values, and governance structures, but the underlying danger to thieves remained constant across these regional variations. Medieval attitudes and approaches toward theft were not static, but evolved significantly over the course of the period, reflecting broader changes in society, governance, and religious thought. From the early medieval reliance on compensation to the later development of more systematized punishment, the treatment of thieves underwent substantial transformation between the 5th and 15th centuries. The early medieval period, roughly 5th to 9th centuries, featured legal approaches to theft heavily influenced by Germanic tribal customs. These systems emphasized compensation to victims rather than punishment of offenders. The concept of wergeld, literally man payment, established monetary values for various offenses, including theft. A caught thief would be required to pay compensation to the victim, typically several times the value of stolen goods. Inability to pay could result in enslavement or physical punishment, but these outcomes were secondary to the compensation principle. Religious institutions played crucial roles in early medieval theft response. Monasteries and churches often served as neutral mediators in theft disputes, promoting reconciliation and repentance over purely punitive approaches. Penitentials, handbooks for confessors, prescribed specific spiritual penances for theft based on value, motivation, and victim. creating a parallel system of religious consequences alongside secular compensation requirements. The Carolingian period, late 8th–9th centuries, saw attempts to standardize theft responses through royal capitularies, legislative acts that sought to balance compensation traditions with more consistent punishment. Charlemagne's legal reforms emphasized the king's role in maintaining peace and order, framing theft not just as harm to individual victims, but as a disturbance of social harmony requiring royal intervention. This period marked a gradual shift from viewing theft primarily as a matter between thief and victim towards seeing it as an offense against social order. The 10th–12th centuries witnessed the increasing influence of revived Roman law concepts regarding theft, particularly in areas with stronger ties to the former empire. This influence brought more systematic categorization of theft offenses and standardized punishment approaches. The distinction between manifest theft, caught in the act, and non-manifest theft, with different procedural and punishment implications for each, reflects this Roman law influence. University-trained lawyers and judges began applying these concepts in secular courts, gradually formalizing theft prosecution. The 13th century represented a significant turning point in theft punishment throughout much of Europe. This period saw the widespread codification of previously oral or customary law into written legal texts. Swedish provincial laws were committed to writing during this century, creating explicit hierarchies of theft punishment based on value. Similar codification occurred across Europe, though with regional variations in content. This movement toward written law increased procedural consistency, while often formalizing severe punishments for theft. The late medieval period, 14th to 15th centuries, saw increasing state involvement in theft prosecution and punishment. As centralized governance strengthened in many regions, theft prosecution shifted from primarily private accusations toward more state-initiated proceedings. Professional officials, rather than victim accusers, increasingly drove theft prosecutions, reflecting the view that theft represented an offense against social order, requiring public response, regardless of victim participation. Economic changes influenced theft punishment throughout the period. The increasing monetization of the economy, growth of urban centers, and development of long-distance trade all affected both theft opportunities and responses. As movable wealth became more significant and anonymous, theft laws adapted to address these changing conditions. The late medieval period saw increased attention to commercial theft, counterfeiting, and fraud alongside traditional concerns with direct property taking. Black Death's dramatic demographic and economic impact in the mid-14th century temporarily altered theft patterns and enforcement. Labor shortages following the plague created economic opportunities that reduced subsistence theft in some regions, while simultaneously disrupting traditional enforcement mechanisms. The post-plague period saw increased concern with controlling worker mobility and preventing property crimes against depopulated properties, reflected in statutes like England's Ordinance of Labourers, 1349, that indirectly affected theft prosecution. The late medieval period witnessed early experiments with incarceration as punishment for theft, though this remained secondary to corporal and capital punishment throughout the period. Some urban areas established houses of correction that confined thieves for fixed terms alongside other minor offenders, representing early precursors to modern prison systems. These institutions combined punishment with forced labor, allowing communities to extract economic value from thieves while removing them from society. Throughout these evolutions, certain constants remained in medieval approaches to theft. The status disparity in theft punishment persisted across the entire period, with higher status thieves consistently receiving more lenient treatment than their lower status counterparts for equivalent offenses. Similarly, the public and exemplary nature of theft punishment remained consistent, though the specific forms of public display evolved with changing sensibilities and enforcement capacities. By the end of the medieval period, the treatment of thieves had evolved from primarily compensation-based approaches toward more standardized state punishment, from oral traditions toward written codes, and from purely local enforcement toward more centralized systems. These evolutions created more procedurally consistent outcomes for thieves, but rarely reduced the severity of punishment they faced. Instead, state involvement often intensified punishment while disconnecting it from direct victim interests, creating the foundation for early modern criminal justice approaches that would continue to treat theft as deserving severe response. The medieval thief's experience represents more than a historical curiosity. It illuminates fundamental aspects of medieval society while leaving legacies that influenced subsequent approaches to crime, punishment, and social control. Understanding why it sucked to be a medieval thief provides insight into property values, class structures, religious worldviews, and governance systems that shaped the medieval world. Property crime in medieval Europe operated at the intersection of economic necessity and social control. The harsh punishments inflicted on thieves reflected not just concern with protecting property, but determination to maintain social hierarchy and communal order. When a starving peasant was hanged for stealing food while a nobleman might escape punishment for more significant appropriation, the message was clear. The moral wrong lay not just in taking property, but in disrupting the established social order through unauthorized redistribution.